Hey folks, my name is John Lee and welcome back to the channel. So in my last video, we talked about the 5 different theories about Korean unification, which implies that there are possibly different scenarios as to how Korean unification could take place. But before we can talk about Korean unification or how it would look or what it would look like or what needs to happen for it to take place, I think that we first need to talk about the reasons that some people give for supporting the idea of Korean unification. And in order to talk about the ideas that support Korean unification, I think we cannot not talk about this man, Min-seok. Now, unless you're Korean, there's a very high probability that you do not know who this man is, and that's fine. But Min-seok is a bit of a celebrity here in South Korea. He is a celebrity teacher. He's actually a history teacher, and he's written a lot of books on that topic, and he's also been on TV quite a bit. But the reason why I picked Min-seok to talk about is that a few years ago he gave an hour-long presentation on TV where he laid forth his arguments to support the idea of Korean unification. And so, because I mentioned the last time that I am not a fan of Korean unification, what I want to do for this video is to go over the arguments that he gives and to basically break them down and explain why I disagree with them. Now, I want to mention that I will provide the link to the video where Min-seok gave that hour-long presentation, but I also feel the need to point out that unfortunately there are no English subtitles for that video. So, if you can speak Korean, great. If you can't, I'm sorry, I do not have any other links where English subtitles are available. But anyway, let's go over the arguments that Min-seok gave in that video. Now, the very first argument that he made is a humanitarian one. Min-seok mentions that there are about 20,000 people who are still living in South Korea to this day who are separated from their family members in North Korea. Now keep in mind that the video that Min-seok made was originally filmed in 2016. And he said that at the time, the average age of a South Korean citizen who still has family members up in North Korea was about 90. And so, seeing how it's been 4 years since that original video was made, obviously the average age has gone up since then. And Min-seok makes the argument that it would be the moral thing to do for both North and South Korea to reunify so that these elderly citizens can go back to meeting their family members again. Now, the very topic of divided families across the Korean Peninsula is an emotional issue. It's heart-wrenching to imagine being separated from family members for more than 70 years. But I think it's quite important that we also try to maintain a balanced view of how things should turn out. National unification is an extremely traumatic event that will take place, if it ever does take place. It would be an extremely traumatic experience that would affect tens of millions of people. And the idea of two countries having to reunify in order to satisfy the desires of tens of thousands of people at the expense of tens of millions of people seems like it would be the kind of political decision that would be a little hard to make. There are other ways that divided families can still meet. Now, currently, the preferred method that's available is the North and South Korean family reunions that take place once every few years when diplomatic relations between North and South Korea are just perfectly aligned underneath the stars. These family reunions are hardly perfect. In fact, I refer to them as tragedy porn. The way these families are chosen to meet is that the South Korean side uses a lottery system that picks out the number of people who would be able to meet their North Korean family members, and the North Korean side chooses people based on how loyal they are to the regime. And once these people are allowed to meet on a designated date once every few years, unfortunately for them, they can only meet for about 3 days at the most, I believe, and then they can never see each other again. And during these 3 days, their reunions are closely guarded and they're filmed by journalists all over the world, and their tearful, brief reunion and their extremely heartbreaking separation is broadcast all over the world. And the fact that they can never see each other again is just not an actual family reunion, is torture. And so this system that's available right now does allow divided families to meet, but it is extremely problematic. And the only side that is truly guilty in this is North Korea. The South Korean government has repeatedly asked the North Korean government to cooperate in order to allow these divided families to meet, but each and every time, well, mostly every time, the North Koreans tend to say no because of reasons, I guess. And so I believe that pressure should be applied in North Korea to pressure the North Korean regime to permit more and extended family reunions. And also, if the North Korean government does not cooperate, I believe that there could be other methods available for these families to meet. Perhaps by virtual meetings that are overseen by governmental minders if the North Koreans are really that afraid of these families getting to talk to each other. Either way, there are other methods that divided families can still meet and reunite that would not necessitate the involvement of something as traumatic as national reunification. Now, aside from that one humanitarian argument that Sun Min-seok gives, all the other arguments that he gives are purely economic arguments, and in my opinion, I think they're a bit easier to debunk. The second argument that Sun Min-seok gives is that North Korea possesses a lot of rare earth minerals that could possibly be worth trillions of dollars, and he believes that if North and South Korea reunite to form one country, South Korean capital, technology, and know how would be able to synergize with North Korean natural resources, and that this would eventually help to turn the Korean economy into an economic powerhouse. Now, this is obviously an enticing economic prospect. Currently, China holds a near monopolistic control over rare earth resources, and if a united Korean peninsula is able to extract and exploit North Korean rare minerals, as Park Geun-hye said, it would be a bonanza for the Korean economy. Now, does North Korea possess rare earth minerals? It seems likely that it does. A lot of experts have pointed that out. However, what's not exactly clear is just how much natural resources that it has and whether or not it would actually be beneficial to extract them. You see, the problem with talking about North Korea is that it is such a closed off and opaque society that at the end of the day, no matter what North Korea related topic we're talking about, at the end we are always just talking about speculations. We don't really know what kind of rare earth minerals that North Korea has. We don't know how much it has. We do know that North Korea is an impoverished and backward country, and that if any attempts are made to extract North Korea's rare earth minerals, a lot of money will need to be invested in to improve North Korea's infrastructure. North Korea's roads and factories and bridges and electrical supplies and power grids will all have to be built from the ground up, and this would cost billions upon billions of dollars. Would the North Korean rare earth minerals be able to offset those costs? Some people think so, but nothing is certain. Now, the third and the fourth argument that Sun Min-seok gives to support Korean unification is that he believes that South Korean capital would be able to synergize with cheap North Korean labor, and that this would also help to boost the South Korean economy, or rather the United Korean economy. Now, I think that this is quite a short sighted argument to give, and the reason for that is that yes, North Korean labor is cheaper compared to South Korean labor right now, but that's because right now they are divided countries. If North and South Korea reunite to form one country, North Korean labor would not be as cheap as they are now, and that's because, presumably, the same wage laws that apply in South Korea would also apply in North Korea. Like many other countries in the world, in South Korea, the minimum wage is a sensitive issue, and that's because the minimum wage arguments always entail around these particular topics of a living wage and the dignity of work. Now, we cannot argue about the dignity of work and the necessity of having a living wage for South Koreans, but deny that same privilege for the North Koreans once they become part of the same country. Now, the fourth argument that Sun Min-seok gives has to do with the population itself. He believes that once the two Koreas reunite to form one larger country, the much larger population would be able to serve as a larger domestic market. Now, this is somewhat true, but only if we ignore a lot of realities on the ground. On paper, yes, South Korea currently has a population of about 50 million people, which is also the world's fastest aging society, and North Korea has about 25 million younger people. And once these two countries unite to form one country, yes, it would help to balance out South Korea's aging population. Unfortunately, the problem with that argument is that it ignores a lot of problems on the ground. We don't need to look that far ahead to find out why. We just need to look at the North Korean defectors who are currently residing in South Korea. As it turns out, escaping from North Korea, as difficult as it is not the end of the challenges that they face. When North Korean defectors leave North Korea and settle down in South Korea, they also have to adapt to South Korean society, which, as it turns out, is harder than many people like to think. A lot of North Koreans have not gotten accustomed to how money works. They don't know how credit cards work. The education and the socialization that the North Korean people have received for over 70 years has been so uniquely North Korean that their experience is hard to translate to what the rest of the world sees as normal. These 25 million people would need to be socialized away from the society that they knew in order to get accustomed to a new, modern, and capitalist society. So, way in the future, maybe 40, 50 years down in the future, a united Korean peninsula might finally be able to see the rewards of this much larger population. But until that day comes, there would be a lot of problems and a lot of pitfalls that the United Korean Peninsula would need to overcome. And I'm not sure if either South or North Korea, as they currently exist today, are ready to face those challenges. The fifth argument that Min-seok makes is that while he understands that people are concerned about the cost of reunification, he contends that in the long run, the cost of reunification would be cheaper than the cost of continued division. And to prove his point, he talks about the military. Currently, North and South Korea are each other's enemies, and therefore, each year, South and North Korea spend a lot of money on their own defense expenditures. In the previous year, South Korea spent about $40 billion on its military, which was about 7% of its GDP. The numbers for North Korea are less reliable, but they spent approximately about 20% of their GDP on their military. And that's a lot of money. Son Min-seok believes that once the two countries reunite and no longer pose an existential threat to each other, both countries would be able to cut their military expenditures and perhaps even do away with the conscripted military force and institute an all-volunteer army. I believe that this is complete and utter nonsense. Even if the two Koreas reunite, it would still be improbable that the united Korean state would suddenly cut defense costs. And that's because even if they reunite peacefully, this newly united Korean state would still have territorial disputes with Japan. It would still have to contend with external threats from China and Russia. There would still be quite a lot of external dangers that the Korean peninsula would have to face, and it is improbable that they would suddenly cut defense costs just because the Korean peninsula is now one state again. Also, this idea that a united Korean state would somehow replace its conscription military system with an all-volunteer military force is simply wishful fantasy. And that's because if we really think about it, it would lead to a lot of social problems. Right now, South Koreans are about 50 times wealthier than their North Korean counterparts, and this would have an important role to play in a united Korean peninsula. If the United Korean state decides to replace the conscription system with an all-volunteer military force, a lot of South Korean men would probably not be willing to serve the military anymore because they would have a lot more economic opportunities available to them. Why would they want to serve in the military when they can just work at any other jobs and earn a lot more money? But the same opportunities would not be available to the North Korean men. Once the two Koreas reunite, it won't take long for the North Koreans to realize that they are hopelessly backward compared to their South Korean counterparts, and that this will have a lot of real-world consequences, especially when it comes to employment discrimination. North Koreans, especially North Korean men, would find it extremely hard to find gainful employment. And so, if this United Korean state imposed a voluntary military force, a lot of North Korean men would feel that they would have no choice but to serve in the military because that would be the one area where they would have economic opportunities. And this could have dire consequences down the road. And that's because over time, people tend to look at the past with rose-tinted glasses. Over time, as the former North Koreans realize that they are second-class citizens in this newly united Korean state, they will feel a lot of resentment. They will feel a lot of resentment for the state. They will feel a lot of resentment toward their South Korean brethren. And as resentment grows, a lot of these people will possibly long for the days of the current regime in North Korea. And can you imagine the problems that would arise if that were to happen, when a significant portion of the military would be North Koreans and they feel resentment toward their South Korean brethren? So when we couple this North Korean resentment with the possibility that the bulk of the military would be made up of North Koreans, this could have dire consequences for the united Korean state. So, no, In order to ensure national unity and national cohesion, it is highly unlikely that this United Korean States would do away with the conscripted military force. The final argument that Min-seok gives to support unification is that once it takes place, South Korea will no longer be an island. Due to the division of the Korean Peninsula, South Korea does not have any way to access the rest of the Asian continent or Europe by land, and therefore he contends that South Korea is an island. And on that front, he's correct. He also believes that once the two countries reunite, the Korean Peninsula would then be able to access the Trans-Siberian Railway and also have access to Russian oil pipelines, and this would really tremendously boost the Korean economy. Again, that's also all true. However, the problem with that argument is that it completely ignores the North Korean people. Yes, these are certainly prospects that a lot of people desire, but we cannot just assume that only good things will happen through unification and ignore the feelings of the North Korean people. As I said earlier, as time goes on, the North Korean people realize that they are second-class citizens, resentment will start to build up. There are also going to be North Koreans from the beginning who are going to oppose reunification. These people are most likely going to be members of the North Korean elites. These people currently have the power and the status and the money. Yes, they live in a terribly closed off and poor country, but right now, they're at the top of the food chain. Why would they desire reunification? Through one faction or another, through one reason or another, there's bound to be resistance and perhaps even an insurgency against the concept, against this very idea of a united Korean state from former North Korean military personnel and politicians and anyone who feels like they're going to lose money or status. So yes, there is the possibility of connecting with the rest of the Asian and European continents through land. But we cannot just focus on the rosy pictures as Min-seok looks at and ignore all of the human suffering and all of the human resistance that we might need to contend with. If I had to reduce all of the arguments that I have against Min-seok's arguments, it would be that the arguments that he has put forward are all rather colonialist. Now, to a certain extent, it's understandable. If we take nuclear weapons out of the equation, obviously it is South Korea that is much wealthier and more powerful than North Korea. So if reunification takes place, even if it is completely peaceful, it would still be led by the South and not the North. And so yes, it makes sense to look at the prospect of Korean unification through a South Korean lens. But doing just that and ignoring potential North Korean resistance is going to be seen as yet another reason as to why North Korea would be resentful against us, because they would see it as arrogant, and they would be right to do so. Now that I've spent the entire time arguing against reunification, does this mean that I am in favor of maintaining the status quo? No, absolutely not. That would be a monstrous thing to say. However, that would bring us to a different topic, and I feel like it would be more appropriate to talk about it in a different video. Okay, so that about wraps it up. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button as well as the notification bell. And if you have any comments, please feel free to leave it down below. I read all the comments that you guys write. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.